If you're working in a Spring Boot application that uses Spring Security and you need to authenticate against the database using Spring Data JPA, you're in the right place. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Dan Vega, and I'm a Spring Developer Advocate for VMware. So we've been doing a lot of videos on Spring Security lately, and we've taken a natural progression to working with users. So we started out with creating an in-memory user, which is really great for demos, prototypes, proof of concepts, not really great for production, right? We moved on to using JDBC, so we talk to a database using JDBC. There's actually a built-in mechanism for this in Spring Security called the JDBC User Details Manager. So we looked at both of those, but there is no built-in mechanism for talking to a database using JPA. That's the bad news. The good news is it's actually pretty simple to do once we understand the different components that we need to work with. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to build an application from scratch using Spring Boot, Spring Data JPA. We'll use an in-memory database to start. Again, this can be kind of moved over to a real database later on if you want. But we'll talk about the different pieces that go into building authentication, talking to a database using Spring Data JPA. I've been looking forward to this one. I hope you enjoy it. What are we waiting for? Let's write some code. All right, so we're going to get started as we always do over at start.spring.io. This is a Java project using the latest stable version of 2.7.4. We're going to go ahead and enter a group of dev.danvega. We'll call this JPA security. As always, the code that we go through today will be in the description below, so go ahead and grab that if you want to follow along. I'm going to go ahead and add some dependencies here. We're going to build a web application. We're actually going to use JPA as well, so Spring Data JPA. We also need a database. I'm going to choose H2. I hear some people moaning. Don't worry about it. I know it's an in-memory database, not for production. Nothing changes if you swap in something like MySQL or Postgres or SQL Server. If you want another example of me using something like Postgres with like a Docker Compose file, please reach out to me. Let me know in the comments and I'll put that together for you. So we have Spring Web, Spring Data JPA, our H2 database. We're going to go ahead and generate this and open it up in your favorite IDE. I'm going to go ahead and open this up in IntelliJ and we'll get started. All right, so I'm going to get started by creating a few packages in here just so we kind of have a setup. So I'm going to need a config package. I'm going to need another package for controllers. I'm going to need a package for, let's say, a model. We'll also want a package for a repository. So repository, I don't know why I always have trouble spelling that. I don't know what is going on there. So we have a repository, we have a model, we have a controller. We'll probably have a package for a service. So I think that will be enough. The first thing that we need to do is we need to create a model. So we're creating an entity for posts. So I'm working with a post domain. We're building out a blog here. I have a post that has things like title, content, author, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new post. So we'll call this post. And in the JPA world, we need to mark this with @entity. I don't want to get too specifics into kind of Spring Data JPA. This is more focused on the security stuff. So if you're interested in more content around JPA, let me know. So we need an ID and we need to generate that value because I don't want to do it. So we'll say private long ID. We're also going to create a title. We're going to create a slug. We're going to create some content. We're going to create an author. We'll have local date time for published on, and then we'll have one for not created on, we want updated on. So that gives us everything we need. We also need a no args constructor because we are going to overwrite the implicit one. Because we are going to create one for going ahead and setting a new post. So I'm going to set a new post. I'm going to take in a title, a slug, and some content, and an author. So that's all I'm going to take in. The reason for that is, so let's do This looks pretty good. Wow. Thank you, GitHub Copilot. It just keeps saving me time here. So we're going to set the title. We're going to set the slug. We'll set the content and the author. The published on, I'm going to set to the local datetime now. Actually, the updated one, I'm not going to set at all. That can be null in the database. So what happens on the front end when we take a look at this, if it's null, we're not going to display it. Like it was just created on this date and time, or it was published on this date and time. If it's not null, then we're going to say, hey, it might have been created last year, but I updated it at this time and date. So we have that. Let's go ahead and create a getters and setters. So let's do that. So I'm going to go ahead and create these. Going to go ahead and create a toString, and we probably could have gotten away without talking about posts, but I just want to kind of bring some real world example in here. Before we create our controller, we're going to create a repository so that we just don't have everything to do with security here. I want this to be more like, hey, here's how we open up our API, so we'll talk about everything as we go throughout this, but I need a post repository. That's going to be an interface that extends CRUD repository. So that is of type post. The ID type is a long. So we'll do that. That gives us everything we need there. We're going to create a new controller. We'll call this post controller. Inside of post controller, I will go ahead and mark this as a REST controller, request mapping, and we will say /API/posts. So I need an instance of that repository. So we'll say private final post repository. We'll call this posts. We'll get it through constructor injection. So we have some dependency injection happening there. And then we'll just have two methods here. One to get all of the posts. So that actually returns an iterable of posts. And we'll call this find all. And we can return post.final. And finally, we have a get mapping. So if we take in a ID, so it'll be /ID, I'll go ahead and return the post. So we're going to call this find by ID. And a little trick, I talked about this in a recent video. If you want to go ahead and look at it, I will leave a link in the description and hopefully a card up top here. We're talking about, we can assign using a domain class converter the ID, and what it will do is go out to the CRUD repository and do a find by ID for us. So we can just say post, and return post. So we don't have to do that post repository lookup by ourselves. That should just get automatically converted for us to a post. So there's our post. We have our repository. We need to do some configuration now. So I'm going to go in here and create a new class called security config. This is going to be a configuration class. This is also going to enable web security. Oh, we didn't include Spring Security. So that's okay. Sometimes I forget things. I'm getting old. Let's go ahead and include another dependency. So we'll say dependency. And we're going to include, Spring Boot Starter Security from there. And we'll go ahead and refresh Maven. Everything looks like it's okay. So now I can enable web security. All right, so far so good. The next step here is we need to configure Spring Security. So what I'm going to do is start by creating a bean, not a beam, Dan, a bean. And this is going to be of type security filter chain. We'll call this security filter chain. This takes in HTTP security. And again, if you're kind of new around here, that's okay. We welcome you. I've done a bunch of videos on security and security configuration in general lately. And this is kind of the new approach to configuring Spring Security. You used to have to extend a web security configure adapter. That's no longer the case. We've deprecated that abstract class in favor of a more component-based model. So we're going to create this bean, and that is going to return that http.build at the end of the day. This is going to throw an exception, and we're going to go ahead and configure some things here. So I am going to authorize requests, and this will take an auth dot. So any requests, we want to go ahead and make sure we're authenticated, but we will have some exceptions here. So what about the case for our MVC matchers on /API/posts? We want to go ahead and permit all. So that's one. The other thing we got to do, and again, I've talked about this in a previous video, is we're going to use H2 today. And when we want to use H2, we have this H2 console, right? That we can view like tables and columns and run SQL commands and things like of that nature. We want to make sure that that is enabled for us without any kind of security stuff. We don't want to log into the H2 console. Again, it's only a development thing, so not a big deal. So what I'm going to do here is cross-site request forgery. We're going to say csrf.ignoring ant matchers. So again, I've talked about this in a previous video, but we need to do that. We need to say ant matchers, H2 console, permit all. And finally, we need to just say on the header side, I want you to go ahead and in the frame options, go ahead and allow, frame options dot same origin. So that will give us everything we need to then go ahead and view the H2 console. Okay, so we're starting to get there. We've set up a post. We have a post repository to save new posts. We have this post controller that we can hit and view all or view one. And we've got a security config. We've basically overridden the default security configuration that Boot gives us out of the box. And we've said, here's what security looks like in our system. Now, we currently don't have any users, and that's okay. We don't need a user because we can go ahead and view the H2 console. We can go ahead and hit /API/posts. We just need to do a couple more things. So on the application.property side, we need to configure a couple properties. First off, we need to say that, hey, that H2 console, I want to go ahead and enable that because I'd like to go ahead and view that. On the data source side, we generate a unique name in H2. We don't want to do that. So I don't want to generate a unique name because for my data source name, I'm going to go ahead and set that to something like blog. Finally, on the JPA side, show SQL, I want to go ahead and say true. That just does some logging in the console for me and lets me know what's going on. So last but not least, we need to get at least one post into our database so we can see it. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to create a bean of type command line runner. So this command line runner is going to allow us to do some things, execute some code. And this command line runner is a functional interface. That's why we're returning this Lambda expression here. And what we want to do is we actually want to use the post repository. So let's say post repository, posts, to go ahead and insert some data. Again, the command line runner is something that will be created for us and be executed after the application context has been created and before the main application runs. That's why we are able to get an instance of our post repository. So all I'm going to say here is posts.save, new post, and what does our post constructor look like? We need a title, slug, content, and author. So a new title is going to be Hello World. Our slug is something like this, Hello World. Our, content, welcome to my blog. And then we need an author. We'll just say Dan Vega. So with that, I think we have done everything we need to get this up and running. Let's see if we've written a whole bunch of code without any errors. I'm going to hopefully say yes, but let's see. Let's go ahead and run this application and see what happens. Hey, we did it. We have some things going on here. So we do have a user. I forgot to mention that because we didn't override the default user yet. There is a user. We're not going to really worry about that user. You see some inserts happening, a single insert here for post. So let's go over to the browser and take a look at the H2 console. All right, so here I am. Again, my data source name is blog. I'm going to go ahead and connect to that database. And you see, we haven't created any schema because in the JPA world, there's some configurations happening underneath the hood to say, go ahead and create that table for me and create those columns based on the fields in that entity. So if I go ahead and select star from post and run that, you can see that we have all of those fields in there. And then again, that updated on is null. That's exactly what we want. So far, so good. And then I guess let's go back to the browser. We can always go to /API/posts. We can see all of the posts. We can go to /API/posts/1. Oh, and we did not open that up. Okay, so no worries. Not a big deal. Okay, so a lot of this is the same, right? What we want to do is go back to the security config and talk about users. So we have a user in here. So we used in previous examples, we've created an in-memory user. We've also we also talked to a database using the JDBC user details manager. So the way that we do that is we can go ahead and create beans, right? So we say bean user, let's say in-memory user details manager. And then if we look at in-memory user details manager, this implements a user details manager. And there are, oops, I want to go there. And then there are two implementations of user details manager, the in-memory user details manager and the JDBC user details manager. So those are the two examples that we looked at of creating users. But what we really want is a JPA user details manager. And there isn't one built into Spring Security. So we're going to have to kind of roll around. Again, I said this at the kind of top of the video. That's the bad news. The good news is this isn't that hard. There is actually a pretty simple, easy way to get this done. So we're going to save this. And what we need to do now is create a new service that implements that user details service. So I'm going to go into the service package. I'm going to create a new Java class. I'm going to call this JPA user details service. And we're going to go ahead and implement the user details service. And now it's going to say, hey, you're implementing this interface. I need you to go ahead and implement a method in there. There's only one method, so we have to implement that method. This is load by username, takes in a username, and if it can't be found, it throws a username exception. So what's important to understand here is that this is just a method that we are going to implement. Right now, this has nothing to do with looking up users in a database. This is simply a method that we have to implement. So what we could end up doing is returning a hard-coded user if we want, or a user that we look up in a database using something like Spring Data JPA. So let's start with the fact that we need to return a user details. So what is the user details? This is the core user information. So implementations are not used directly by Spring Security for security purposes. This simply stores user information, which is later encapsulated into the authentication object. So this is the contract that we have to meet at some point. So before we get there, I don't want to talk about this right now. This is what we're going to have to use eventually. Now we need to come back and start thinking about the user. So what I want to do is create a new Java class in model. We're going to call this user. And this is just going to be an entity, the same way that post was an entity. So we're going to create an entity. Again, this is going to have an ID annotation, a generated value annotation. This is going to be of type long. We'll call it ID. And it will also have things like, hey, I need a username. I need a password. and I need a bunch of roles. So right now we're just going to store this in a simple string. You can obviously move this out into another table or an entity. Right now I'm just going to leave it there. And speaking of, I do want to store this in a table called users, not users. I'm going to change that table name. So with the JPA entity, we're going to need that noarg constructor. We're going to need a constructor to create a new user. So we'll say string username, string password, string roles. That looks good. We'll need some getters and setters for all of these. So I'll go ahead and create that. And then I'll go ahead and create a new toString. That looks good. So now we have a user that we can store in the database, right? Now that we have a user, let's go into our repository package. We're going to create a new user repository. Again, that's of type interface. It extends CRUD repository of type user. So make sure you use the right user here. There's a bunch of different users in here, even one by Spring Security. Make sure we use ours, and that type is going to be long. So with our user and our user repository, we could go ahead and add some users to the database, right? We can come in here and say user repository, users, and we can go ahead and add some users here. Not a post. Come on, Copilot, get with it. So I can say users.save, and then I'm going to create a new user. So again, we're using that dev.danvega user. And I'm going to create one called user. It's going to have a password of password for now, and it's going to have a role of role underscore user. And then let's create one more. We'll say that this one is going to be admin, password, and then this is also going to have a role of admin. So again, I'm just taking a simple string. We can go ahead and split on the comma. So it's a comma separated list of roles. And that's what I'm going to use as the roles. Again, you can kind of move that out into a separate table if you wanted to. This will work fine for my instance. So I just want to make sure that everything is working as I expect it right now. We see some insert into users, and posts. So we should be able to go back to the H2 console, go ahead and log in. And now we see our users table. And if we run that, we see our two users, user and admin. All right, so now that I have my users in the database, how do I authenticate against those? So I could come in here to the JPA user details service, and I could try to return that user that we created. So we have this user entity. But as you can see, that's not going to satisfy the contract of this method, which is to return a user details. So we have this user details interface. Now, one thing you might think to do is come in here and just say implement user details. And that is what I've done in the past. I do want to share out a nice little tip here that I picked up from Lar over on Twitter, who has a really great YouTube channel, who has a book on Spring Security. I've learned a lot from him, over the years. So definitely go ahead and check him out. Thanks, Lar, for the tip here. But instead of polluting my user entity and having all of these other user details things inside of here, what I want to do is actually split that out. And I want to go ahead and create a new class. We're going to call this security user. And what we want to do here is implement user details here. So now we'll go ahead and implement any of the methods that are in here. And now we have all of those methods. So I don't know why it puts these in such a weird order. So I want to do username and password. And let's see, our authorities. And then our account expired. So these four I'm actually just going to set to true, 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 and true. Okay, so with those in place, what I'm going to do is actually just defer to my user now. So I'm still kind of using the user entity that I've created and the security user, but now I have, separation of concern. I've kind of separated those two things. One is the user, it's an entity that I'm storing in the database. The other one is the user that I need to authenticate against. So I'm going to get an instance of my user here, And we'll do that through a constructor. So now when I go ahead and populate the security user, I'm just sending in a user. And now I can say user.getUsername. And I can say user.getPassword. And then for the collection here of authorities, what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to have to stream this because my user.getRoles returns a string. And what I want to do with that is actually split. So I don't know why I'm getting this weird. So I'm splitting on the comma. And then once I have those, so let's say let's just make this a little bit more readable. So user.getRoles, we're going to split on that. Then what I'm going to do is go ahead and Copilot here messing with me. So what I want to do is map that to a simple granted authority, right? And then what I want to do is return a list. So that should give me what I need. Nope. Missed something there. So we're splitting. So we're getting the roles, which is just a string. So it has like role underscore user, comma, role underscore admin. We're splitting on that comma. And then we are mapping that to a simple granted authority. So again, this is our granted authority, creating a new instance of that and just returning a list. And then the rest of these, we're just hard coding to true for now to satisfy this. So now we have a security user. Now we have something we can work with because the security user implements user details. We can go ahead and return that. So now what we need to do is, okay, we need to check to see if the username that is getting passed to us is a valid one. If it's not, we're going to throw a username not found exception. So to do this, we need an instance of that user repository that we created. So I'm going to say private final user repository. We'll get that via constructor injection. And now I can say user repository dot find by username and pass in my username. Now you can see we're getting a little error here. We don't have a find by username method in our user repository, but that's okay. We can go ahead and create one. So we can say is we want to get an optional back of type user. So that's our user that we created before, right? And oops, why did that? We just want to import optional. And then this find by username is a query method. It's being derived from the name. So the query is being derived from by username. So it knows to basically select star from user where username is equal to whatever parameter we're passing in here. So that'll give us what we need. That'll return a user. So what we want to do with that, though, is we want to, let's go ahead and return this. We can do this so we can say find by username. And if you find somebody, I want you to go ahead and map it to that security user that we just created. Or else, go ahead and throw. We need to satisfy the contract here of throwing a username not found exception. So I'm going to say new username not found exception. And I'll just say username not found. And we could pass in the username that was given to us. So there we go. So now we have this one method implemented. So we have a load by username. So when someone logs in with, say, user and password, Spring Security is first going to, they're not going to do it yet. There's one more step we have to do, but they are going to end up passing this username to this load by username method. If we have a username in our database, then we will say, yes, we found this one. Go ahead and try to authenticate with that user. If not, it will throw a username not found exception, and then we won't have to authenticate against it. So with this in place, we're almost there. Back in our security config, there's one more thing we need to do. We've not told our security configuration where our user details service is. Like what, we didn't set that up yet. And if we look at our JPA user details service, it's actually not being handled by Spring yet. It's not in the application context. So I'm going to mark this with @service, and now we can get an instance of that, right? So what we want to do in here is say user details service. So hey, I need a user details service here. How can I pass this instance in? So knowing that it's created, Spring is managing an instance of that in the application context for us. We can say private final user details service. There's only one. And actually, we could be specific here. We can say JPA user details service, JPA user details service, and we'll get that via constructor injection. And now we can say JPA user details service. And now Spring Security knows, hey, this is the user details service that I need to do when I need to go look up that user by a username. So let's just double check to make sure that we've done everything. So we have our security filter chain here. We're saying, hey, here's our user details service. This is getting injected via constructor injection. We have our user repository to go out and find a user by a username. If we find it, go ahead and map that user. So basically map that to a security user. So it will end up passing that user into the constructor because it's method reference here. And it's going to get us a security user back. So that security user will satisfy this user details contract. So let's see if this works. Let's go ahead and run this. Okay, no errors. That's good. Hi, Laura. How you doing? Let's see if we can still get here. We have our users still, so user and password. So what I want to do is actually go to localhost 8080. This is going to ask us to authenticate. I think I still have one from before, so let's go ahead and restart this. No, did we not set that up yet? No, we just have a post controller. Let's do something to test this out real quick. Let's go into our controller. Let's create a new Java controller. We'll call this home controller. We'll have this as a REST controller. Let's say that we have on the get mapping, so we have a home method. So public string home. So that means really anybody should be authenticated to hit that. Let's say that we have a user mapping. So public string user, hello user. And let's say we have a get mapping for admin, public string admin. And we're going to return hello admin. Okay, so those are our three methods. So really both of them have the user role. So either user should be able to get to all three of these, and then the admin should only be able to get to this one. So to fix this, we need one more thing in our security configuration. We need to enable method level security. So that will fix that. And then we just need to say, hey, pre-authorize this. It should have a, has role, nope, has role underscore user, and that should be that. So that is for there. This one you should be an admin for. Let's go ahead and restart and see if we can attempt to log in. So let's just go to the root. All right, so something I just realized here is we didn't actually turn on how we're going to log in. So you either need to have HTTP basic authentication or a form login. So I'm just going to say HTTP basic. We'll say with defaults here. I'm going to go ahead and restart. And everything looks okay. Let's try and do this again. Okay, so now it's going to ask for a username and password. So if we just hit anything, that username is not going to be found. There is a username called user, so that will be found, but if we put in any password, that's not going to authenticate. So we want to authenticate with user and password. User and password. What did we do for that? Let's see here. So we have user and password. Okay, I know why this is happening. So one more thing we need to look at here is when we are authenticating against users, we need to set the password encoder. So in here, let's just do, so we're going to say bean password encoder, and we're going to return the no-op password encoder.get instance. Now, do not do this in production. Do not do this. We're going to come right back and we're going to change this to an actual password encoder like bcrypt. Just for real quick though, I just want to make sure this works. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh this. We'll say admin, or actually let's say user and password. Cool, so it'll let us in, it'll let us visit the user endpoint, and it will not let us visit the admin password, endpoint. So far, everything's working exactly as we hoped. Now again, we are storing plain text passwords in the database. We don't want to do that. This was just for a demo, so let's fix that. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and use a new bcrypt password encoder. So that'll work. So now what happens here when I set up this user, oops, right here. So now what happens when I set up this user, I need to encode that password. So I'm going to get an instance of that password encoder. We'll call this encoder. And then here, instead of just storing password in the database, I'll use the encoder and say encode and password, right? So now let's go ahead and take this, do the same for admin, save that. Let's go ahead and restart. And what I want to look at real quick is the H2 console. So I'll say H2 console. I'm going to go ahead and log in here, look at the users, and we can see that our passwords are now encoded. But if I go to home, we'll probably have to restart this again. Let's just open up incognito here. So we'll say localhost 8080. So now it's going to ask for admin and password. So I'm typing in password and it let me view that. It's going to let me view the user endpoint because I also have a user role. And it should let me visit the admin endpoint because I have an admin role. So cool, we were able to encode that password. We're no longer storing plain text passwords in the database, which of course is a very bad thing to do. So I think that's it. As I mentioned before, let's just kind of recap a couple things and then I'll mention one more thing. So the security config is the big thing. In the security config, you are defining your user details service. Like how are we going to, where is this class that has implemented the user details service? So we are creating that. This is called JPA user details service. We implement that. It's a single method we got to override. And what we are doing there is using our user repository to look for a user with the username that is being passed to us. If we find one, let's go ahead and map it to that security user that we created to kind of separate those concerns from the user entity itself. So very nice tip there. Also, we are throwing a username not found exception if we don't find that user. So pretty cool stuff here. Not so hard to do once you kind of see everything that's kind of going on in here. And again, this was the next step in the progression that we've been taking in a lot of these security videos. As I mentioned at the beginning, I know we're using H2 here. This is a very simple switch if you want to use something like MySQL or Postgres. In fact, I've done this in the past with like a Docker Compose file to quickly spin up an instance of Postgres on my machine without having to install it. So if that's something you're interested in, I could put a video together on that. Just let me know in the comments below. And if you found value in this video, I hope you did. I hope you're here learning something new today. If you did, do me a favor. Go ahead and hit that thumbs up button. Subscribe to the channel. And as always, friends, happy coding.
There we go.